I'm Kelsey Murrell. I'm an associate here at CM Murray, and I'm joined by the brilliant Anjali Bonner Hughes, who's a psychotherapist experienced in working with people who have experienced trauma. Thank you for joining us today, Anjali.
Thank you, Kelsey. Good to be with you.
Can I ask you, in the legal context, so where we're often dealing with having to collect evidence, we're having to take firsthand accounts from victims or witnesses, how might, whether that be as a lawyer taking evidence from their client, or
Mhm.
perhaps an independent investigator interviewing a number of witnesses, how might the traumatic experience affect someone's memory or behavior in that context?
Yeah, well, it will affect it profoundly, absolutely, because of the damage to the hippocampus, because of the damage to that memory encoding part of the brain. It's going to be quite difficult for a traumatized client or victim to give you kind of a clear and concise story around what happened. So I think the best way to try to kind of get the information you need from that person is to, first of all, start with empathy, start with kindness, and start by really saying, I know this is going to be hard for you. I understand this is a difficult thing to talk about. Please take your time. We can revisit the same questions. We'll give you as much time as you need to really start to give us some answers. So start with kindness, start with empathy, make them feel safe. Again, traumatized people have a very, very hypervigilant amygdala. They're going to be detecting threat all over the place where there might not be threat. So always try as best you can to lower that threat response, to get those defenses down as much as you can by being kind, by having a smile on your face, by being approachable. I think it's also very helpful when working with traumatized people to have them maybe give you information in more than one way. So doing it in a conversation can be quite confrontational and a little bit scary for people who've undergone trauma. So looking someone in the eye and sharing information about that really scary or frightening event in their lives can itself feel threatening. So although you might have to do sort of in-person or face-to-face interviews, also I would say encourage that person to write down their story in the safety and comfort of their own home, to write things down. Also maybe to do voice recordings on their own. So record the story on their own, maybe in their phone. Again, from the safety and sanctuary of their own home, if that's possible, try to get them to write down their story or record their story as maybe sort of a reminder to them of some information they might have forgotten when talking to you, or as a way to sort of get the story out in a place that feels safe. So think about maybe trying to get the information from multiple avenues if possible. And if you're in sort of an interview with a traumatized person, start with empathy, start with kindness. Try not to use too many why questions. Why questions can feel quite judgmental and they can really kind of raise people's defenses. So better to use a how question or a what question or a can you tell me a little bit more about what happened, as opposed to asking a really sort of direct questions. And always kind of give the person you're working with a lot of time, a lot of space, take breaks, let them get up and get some water, go for a walk. Don't kind of throw a barrage of difficult questions at them all at once. And there's a concept from therapy that's quite helpful called fragile process. And this is the idea that vulnerable clients, very often of whom have dealt with trauma in their lives, often respond to core experiences, so the traumatic event, at really high intensity levels or low intensity levels. For example, somebody who maybe has undergone an assault or an attack of some sort, if they're describing it to either a lawyer or their therapist even, they might sort of, again, the amygdala might come into play. They might almost feel that they're back in the event, and there might be really heightened emotion, sort of an outpouring of emotion, real fear, almost as if they're back in the event. Now, some people who've been traumatized have what we would call a low intensity experience, which is related to sort of a freeze response. So we all know about fight or flight, but there's also freeze and there's also fawn. So the freeze response is almost like if an animal detects the presence of a predator, they might play dead. So it's very common for people who've undergone trauma to almost describe the event as if they were floating above themselves, looking at themselves. That's a disassociated response that's related to the freeze response. And very often, those people who have a freeze response to their trauma, when talking about it, they will talk about it in a low intensity way. So they might not be the people who are feeling that fear and really acting out the fear in a visceral and intense way. They might, in fact, be talking about something very painful, but in a very low key, understated, numb sort of way. Now, that's a clue that there has been a freeze response rather than a fight or flight. There's been a freeze. So, noticing the response, noticing the tenor and the way that they're responding to your questions, meeting that with empathy, showing them that you see that it's difficult, making them feel seen and heard, that trust, building up the trust and the credibility can be really helpful. And having that person feel safe enough to then access memory and share it with you in an open way. And also just a couple quick tips, like when you're interviewing somebody, try and sit at a little bit of an angle as opposed to directly face on. Again, that can feel a bit confrontational very often for people who've been traumatized to have somebody directly facing them. So sit at a little bit of an angle, be aware of eye contact. Eye contact can also feel a little bit threatening sometimes. So eye contact is good when you're asking the question, but perhaps when they're answering, look away, look at your notes. Don't sort of maintain prolonged eye contact because that can raise people's kind of threat response when they've been traumatized.
Those are really helpful tips and really helpful examples of how we might see trauma playing out in those common legal contexts. You will have seen how the law as a profession has been coming to a, if not perfect, certainly a better understanding of how trauma may impact testimony, how people give evidence, and how investigators or lawyers representing people may interpret people's behavior and how that might affect how they see one's credibility, for example. Some of the examples you were giving, if somebody is having a low intensity response, some people might make the assumption that that doesn't seem like the response you'd expect, and so therefore you don't find it credible. So your examples have been really helpful in understanding why it's so important that lawyers have this grasp.
Yeah.
Equally, it is difficult, I think, if you're trying to assess what happened and make findings of fact as an investigator, for example, or if you're representing an individual and you do have to have some understanding of the basic facts in order to put a case forward or to defend against a case. And so, what can lawyers do to better prepare themselves for that context?
The critical first step is having a real education in these issues. So I'm so glad that you're doing this interview and that you are trying to learn up on this because it's so important. So it does have a really profound effect on many different areas of one's life. So really trying to get to know your client as best you can. Are they more prone to have a high intensity response when they're talking about their trauma, or a low intensity response? And again, mapping those onto the different threat responses, either fight or flight or freeze or fawn, which we haven't spoken about really, but fawning is particularly if you're undergoing chronic trauma, for example, abuse, sometimes sexual abuse. Fawning is when you kind of play nice. You try to make yourself small, you play nice with the perpetrator, and that's sort of in the hopes that if I'm nice enough, if I'm sweet enough and kind enough, maybe it will go away. Maybe they'll leave me alone. So that's sort of a fawn response. So for example, it's very common for somebody who's been a victim of domestic abuse for people to say, why didn't you leave him or her? Why didn't you leave? Very often that person who chose to stay, that was a fawn response. If I stay, if I'm kind, if I do everything he wants me to do, he won't hurt me anymore. So again, I think the key first step is understanding trauma and understanding the various responses that people have to it and not judging them for that. And again, try to get their story as best you can in multiple different ways. So face-to-face interviewing, I think, may be the least efficacious because it feels the most confrontational to traumatized people to look somebody in the eyes and tell them their story. That can be very, very difficult. And in fact, it can be embarrassing and shame-inducing when they don't remember the details, when they don't remember things that they think they should remember. That can provoke a shame response. And shame is such a strong emotion that can override a lot of other things. So if you're provoking a shame response, even without meaning to, that alone is going to inhibit their ability to recall properly. Be sensitive to that. Give them time, give them space. Again, empathize with them as much as you can. Say, I know this is hard. I can see this is tricky for you. Let's take a little break. Why don't you get some water, go for a walk, do what you need to do to sort of calm down and ground yourself. And again, trying to get the story in more than one way. So if they can write their story down at home on their own, they can record it on their phone, that might feel to be a more kind of safe space for them to kind of release those memories. And the more comfortable somebody is, the more safe they feel, the easier it is for those sort of trapped memories to come to the surface.
In our first video in this series, which was on some practical tips for lawyers who are wanting to use a more trauma-informed approach to their legal representation, we talked a lot about how people who have experienced trauma often feel that what they've lost is agency. And keeping that in mind, and also keeping in mind what you talked about earlier, which is that not everybody responds to trauma in the same way. For some clients that I've had, meeting in person and talking through their experience is their preference. And for others, it's much more helpful to write it down.
Yeah.
And others, if I ask them, can you write out a chronology? That's very overwhelming to them, and they're not prepared to do that on their own. So I think it's worth bearing in mind what you emphasized earlier, that although having a general understanding of how trauma affects the brain is really helpful, also really important to remember that it's not one size fits all and everybody responds differently.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think it's important that maybe you talk to your client about preferences, which is something we do in therapy. So looping them in, trying to understand what they feel more comfortable with, again, that gives them agency. And I'm really glad you brought that into the conversation. That gives them agency. It creates sort of an egalitarian relationship rather than an authority figure sort of dynamic, which again, very often traumatized people are sensitive to, especially if they've undergone sort of chronic trauma in the form of abuse. They will be sensitive to power dynamics and hierarchies. And you also don't want to get into the situation where they're just trying to please you. So that gets a little bit into fawning, where they're telling you a story and maybe trying to fill in the gaps that they don't actually remember because they want to make you happy, because they want to be a good client. So just keep an eye on that. Try to maintain the egalitarianism as much as possible. Be aware of perceived power imbalances and try to meet your client where they are. Create a level playing field. Ask about their preferences. Check in with them. See what makes them feel the most comfortable.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really helpful. And thank you everyone for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this 10-minute talk. This is the second video in our 10-minute talk series on trauma-informed legal representation. Our first video, which you can find on our website, covered practical tips for legal practitioners. And our third video will address best practices for evidence gathering and investigations. For more talks and many more resources, please check out our website at www.cm-murray.com. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey.